Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about building persuasive arguments, which is chapter 15 of our Osborne textbook. How are we going to build our persuasive arguments? We've already worked on our persuasive speeches. Then we've learned that it is sometimes a challenge to bring up logical arguments to support your statement, your message. First of all, we need to focus on the issue. We need to learn how to phrase your issue briefly, concisely, and strongly. And then we need to find information to support your argument, your way of seeing how to resolve the issue. And that evidence will, of course, include, as usual, we know, facts and figures, expert or eyewitness testimony, and examples or narratives from real life. How do we develop our argument? Here are some tips. You can find a news story, you can find media materials with valuable information. If you're preparing for a persuasive speech, ask the following questions before you actually use that information for your speech. What kind of evidence can be found in that news item? How could you use that information as evidence to support your claim? What warrants should you state? What backing would strengthen the warrant by offering further reasoning and evidence? And how could you better focus your argument by qualifying your claim? So these are some of the questions that you ask when you find supporting material from current media. There are certain patterns of reasoning, and we're going to invoke those patterns when we speak to our audiences. Our speech can be constructed in 4 different ways. We can start with deductive reasoning. Deductive is based on principles using commonly accepted beliefs and shared values to warrant our conclusions. Inductive reasoning is the opposite of deductive. It goes from particulars, the facts and exact circumstances, to the broader generalization, which is relevant to the specific case, moving to an overall claim that summarizes your message based on a close examination of particular cases, facts, and figures. So that is induction. Induction is building from a particular towards the general. Causal reasoning addresses causes and effects. What is causing global warming? What is causing the COVID epidemic? And finally, analogical reasoning. It actually uses analogies, addresses a threatening situation or a disputed proposal by comparing it to a similar situation or proposal and drawing lessons from the similarities of the two. How do we use persuasive reasoning? In order to build a strong argument, here are some guidelines to follow. Provide clear definitions of your terms. That's the first step that we take, because there are things that we use casually every day, words like socialism, like global warming, like feminism, gender, identity, and nobody actually takes the time to define those terms. For example, the other day, I'm using this narrative anecdote. We were talking about business, being an entrepreneur, and the speaker, one of the partners in that conversation, said that everybody is doing business. When you come home and renovate your house, you paint your house, you're also doing business. So I suggested at that point that we define the terms of our discussion very clearly. What exactly you mean by business? So there are a lot of words that need definition, and business, of course, is among them. As I mentioned, feminism, gender, identity, socialism, capitalism, etc. So basic terms need to be explained, defined very clearly. Justify your arguments with deductive reasoning based on accepted principles. Use inductive reasoning to demonstrate the reality of your argument. Use causal reasoning to explain the origins of your argument and suggest conclusions. And finally, use analogical reasoning to draw comparisons and to clarify your position. How to move people to action. Here are some tips, and this is all straight from the textbook by Osborne. To invite people to act based on your message, here are some guidelines. Remind listeners about what's at stake. Use examples and stories as models for action. Visualize the consequences of acting versus non-acting. So either way, inaction or action can have consequences, and you bring them up, make them vivid. Demonstrate that you practice what you preach by showing how you would act or you act on your message. Then provide a clear plan of action. Don't just say do something, but tell them exactly what to do. And as a reminder, don't bite too much more than you can chew. Set very reasonable, realistic goals. Ask for public commitments. Remember that this is the time to bring it home, to close your message. So you will need to ask for a commitment, and you will need to hear from your audience that they are committing, even to a small degree. And make it easy for your audience members to take the first step. That is to say, again, make that first step small and realistic so that it doesn't boomerang back to you by being too much. How do you bridge divides between you and your audience? If there are things that people see differently from you, here's how to create identification. Remember, we said that when we speak to an audience, when we speak with an audience, we want first of all to create identification and then integration. But there could be audiences who are reluctant, and we call them reluctant listeners. How to bridge the divide between the speaker and the reluctant listener? First technique, bringing to life images of common heroes or heroines, enemies, and traditions. So this would be the mythos, I think, the mythos element of Aristotle's rhetoric. Some mythical creatures, beings, heroes that we all know and respect. Emphasize shared values, goals, and obligations. That would be the ethos part of your appeal. Picture common problems and explain how they affect your listeners. That would be the logos part. Common problems, explain how they affect people. So the logical explanation. Provide a clear plan of action that they can take together. Urge them to take that. So this is call for action. This is the closing of your message. Spell out an easy first step, such as signing a petition or sending a text to affirm their involvement. So you're asking for commitment from your audience members. Use inclusive language such as pronouns like we and us, or family or team metaphors, and this would be somewhat similar to the pathos, the emotional appeal, bringing people together. Also the integration element of public speaking. So inclusive language, comparing the audience with a family or a team, does the job of bringing them all together. So the book has a very nice chart of fallacies, what can go wrong with your persuasion. And there are a lot of fallacies like red herring, like either or, slippery slope, myth of the mean, so faulty analogy, begging the question, for example, asserting a claim that has not been proven with evidence. It is begging the question that you prove it. So please study the chart, and there is also an interactive exercise that you can do. In other words, when we speak, we use techniques of persuasion. It's very easy to fall into a trap of a faulty technique. Like, we know that sometimes logic can have flaws. The exception proves the rule. No, the exception does not prove the rule. The exception is an exception. Those things are called fallacies. The word fallacy means mistake, right? Ad hominem fallacy is attacking person rather than the issue. So seeing the person, humanizing the issue. Red herring, distracting listeners with sensations and irrelevant information. That's throwing a red herring. Straw figure, creating a likeness of an opposing position that makes it seem trivial, extreme, and easy to refute. So these are all fallacies that you can study and try to avoid when you're building your speeches. Either or, presenting only two options as if they're mutually exclusive. Non sequitur, reasoning in which the claim does not follow from the evidence. As we said, faulty analogy, comparing two aspects that are dissimilar in very important ways, apples and oranges. Bandwagon, arguing that you should do it or believe it because everybody else does. Slippery slope, arguing that one bad event will inevitably lead to others. Post hoc, confusing proximity in time with causation. So if something happens after another event, we say that it's caused by it, but it doesn't necessarily mean, it's making a correlation that doesn't exist. Hasty generalization, generalization where it doesn't belong, drawing conclusions based on insufficient evidence. Myth of the mean, using an average to hide the problem. And I suggest that you read about this a little more carefully because this might require a little more attention. And equivocation, exploiting the ambiguity of language to mislead the audience or avoiding issues at hand. And I might say that the word equivocation really fits its own definition. So, using the average, we would say, for example, myth of the mean, using the average mortality rate for COVID-19 pandemic, we could say that the mortality rates are very low, but it would really mean to avoid the problem because it is pretty fatal, lethal for people who have pre-existing conditions, people who are elderly, and there are a lot of things that are unknown. So if we say that, oh, it doesn't kill everybody, it would be hiding the problem behind some very blank, averaging that doesn't really say much about the real dangers to vulnerable populations. So that was an example of hiding an acute problem behind very flat statistics. Okay, so that was our chapter 15, and we will conclude with another one before we finish reading the Osborne textbook on public speaking. Thank you.